My name is Victoria. I want to congratulate all of us. It's a Sunday morning, so we really must be into climate action. My name is Victoria. I come from Chile. I am an MPA student in the mid-career one. I was privileged to work in my country a lot in climate action. I was in charge of developing the sustainability areas in Corfo, that is the agency of development in Chile, and also in Banco Estado, which is the public bank. They didn't have a sustainability area, and we developed it. I was also in charge of lithium value add in Corfo, so a lot of critical mining and renewables. I'm very happy to be here when they told me you were doing these roundtables, mainly because I really believe emerging and developing countries, we have a strong commitment and we are the key maybe to the gap emission we're living. And I like a saying you have here, like, put your money where your mouth is. I really think financing is maybe not the most glamorous thing, but surely is the key aspect of going along with this capital flow and the developing of projects. I've been in the practitioners area, so I really know how it is to receive a paper and try to implement it, and it's really hard. So it's very good that we're talking about these things, because academia has to get in touch with the persons that are in the field, because then is when you know, like, I can't do what they're telling me to do. So really thank you all. I really hope to get this report we are doing today and getting it in my suitcase along with the Colombian knowledge back to Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. It was so important for us, having Colombia host us today. So we're very grateful for Claudia and all of the rest of the team who's hosted us this morning. We do want to just say there are Chatham House rules for this session, so please do feel free to reuse without names. And with that, I will hand over to the illustrious Nigel Topping.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Colombia, for hosting us. As everything just gets more and more backed up. So as Jacinda says, my name is Nigel Topping. I'm one of the co-founders, along with Jacinda and Gonzalo, Caro, and the whole team of a new NGO which we call Ambition Loop, which we've headquartered in Chile, because we're really trying to focus on how do we mobilize ambition and action in that space between the real economy and multilateral systems, but with a real emphasis on doing that in the global south. So I'm kind of deliberately making myself a sort of aging, white, global north male as in the minority in all of the sort of diversity metrics that we have. We've been really concerned, Gonzalo and I and the rest of the team, about this question about how we mobilise climate finance in emerging and developing economies for some time now. And when Gonzalo and I were champions in the UN climate process, we managed to develop and implement. There you go. We managed to have some real progress with these big global campaigns like Race to Zero, Race to Resilience, and sort of big headline commitments. And okay, headline commitments are nice, but as Victoria could say, the gap between a headline commitment and actually doing something on the ground is huge. So because when we hit a kind of zeitgeist moment, we realised what we needed is much more pragmatic architectures for implementation. So the 2030 breakthroughs and then the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda. That was all about what needed to be done, like we need to restore 15 million hectares of mangroves, or we need to build 100 green steel plants. But they weren't directly addressing the issue of how do we pay for those. So then with Mahmoud in COP27 and since then working with the Champions team, we've done a lot of work on how do we actually mobilise the finance. Started with asking Nixa and Anna Bhattacharya and Vera Somway to actually do the engineering job of saying, what are we talking about? We know it's not 100 billion, right? Turns out it's 2.4 trillion. And really importantly, at least half of that is domestic resource, right? Which is something that's very difficult to talk about in the multilateral, sometimes polarized negotiation space. And a lot of it is private finance. So just talking about reforming the Bretton Woods institutions, right? The whole NDB reform agenda, will not be enough to create Bretton Woods 2.0 because there's just not enough public finance in the world, and a lot of what needs to change is domestic. So We're spending a lot of time working with lots of partners. We're working with the Mangroves Breakthrough. We're working with the Saudi presidency of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification on how do we actually build practical pipelines, building on some of the work with Jean Paul and others, and Sarah there from SLK with Champions have done over the last few years. But we're also trying to say, good, there's a lot of emphasis on reforming the multilateral finance system, but we know it won't be enough because there are other rules of the game which are broken, which are stopping capital from flowing. Jacinda leads an initiative we founded called the Climate Capital Mobilization Accelerator, and she'll explain more about how we've worked with the commissioners there to start focusing on the conversation we want to have today. Really, our objective is to get more specific about what needs to change, so then we can start talking about where these broken rules are being addressed and how we can take those to scale. I would like just to acknowledge that all of our work is always done in the spirit of radical collaboration. So actually many friends here who we're building on with this. SLK I mentioned, Metabolic, we've done a lot of work with the Research Development Forum. Aviva Investors helped us get the whole initiative going. Resonance with Peter. In particular, for this session, the work that AfriCatalyst have been doing, and they'll be leading one of the sessions on the challenge of credit ratings. So thank you to all our partners. We very firmly believe that nothing gets fixed without first identifying who's already doing good work in that area and then trying to build on it. So that's the spirit today. I'm going to be really looking forward to learning. As always, I'm on the steep learning curve like everybody in this space. And with that, let me hand over to Jacinda to explain how we're going to do the session. Thank you.
Great, so now that we all know what the rules of the game are, we have a few people to come down and start to dive in deep, and then basically what we'll do is have this panel to just introduce each of you to what the 5 rules are, and then we'll break up into 5 round tables where each of us can dive into those rules a little bit more and come out with all the answers, right, to international financial reform. But with that, let me just introduce our panelists for today. So if I may start off with Mr. John Merton from Standard Chartered Bank. He will be helping us today talk about capital adequacy. Please feel free to join us. Then I will go to Dauda Sembene, who is the CEO of AfriCatalyst, our research and knowledge partner, and he is doing some amazing work around credit ratings, so he will give us a little bit of deep dive into that. John Paul Adam, our partner in financial unlocking. He is going to be talking to us a bit today about aggregating and aggregating and pooling first loss capital. And then we have Peter Hall from Resonance, who is the CEO, who is all about adaptation and will talk to us today more about systems alignment and the standardization that can help unlock capital flows. So with that, I think we have one more. I don't think Hope made it yet. Did Hope make it? No, I did not see her in the room today. So our last and final topic is going to be around insurance and pension fund allocation. And so we will work that into the conversation as well. So with that, thank you all. Gentlemen, sorry we were supposed to have more women on this panel, but it looks like you have to represent for all of us. But thanks so much for joining us. And maybe I can just go kind of in order here. Peter, if you could tell us a little bit about why one of the important rules. So just a little background. We have 45 commissioners as part of the Climate Capital Mobilization Accelerator. And those commissioners are all practicing financial climate or nature-related investments. And so really what they're doing is they're bringing together their actual tangible insight around what is running wrong with some of the projects that they have invested in or some of the funds that they are helping construct. So it's actual experience. And so what we asked was, out of all of the experiences that you have, what are some of the key issues that you keep running into that are preventing you from allocating more capital into this space? And so out of that came these top 5 issues that we've discussed today. And so we're really hoping that the systems change, the capital allocation, things changing around credit ratings can really start bit by bit unlocking capital. So Peter, if you could just a little bit talk about why this is important for the rules.
Yeah, I think, Nigel touched on this. I've been involved in the Climate Champions team in the past who set a really good stage on the problem. but this gap to getting from, these headline announcements to actually getting financial flows out, especially into adaptation and resilience. We're a little behind on the net zero mitigation work, so the need to have systems, especially have systems to drive collaboration amongst a lot of different players, all sort of have a vested interest in the outcome is super important. And the unique thing with these systems is adaptation is very much local, and you're basically protecting people. So, that's why the work you're doing is so important right now to sort of almost put that next bridge into action through collaboration. And we need to have good systems that different players, and we'll hear about a lot of them today, can see where they fit in and really, I think, unlock a lot more money for adaptation for sure.
Jean-Paul, over to you for why do we need to pool more first loss capital? Why is it so important?
Well, I think I'm speaking very much from my experience in Africa, and essentially we have the challenge of either you have an excellent project which is so obvious that it manages to finance itself, or you have excellent projects which are small and therefore don't have the impact that we want. They may be excellent and have really superb results, but they are such small projects that from the investment perspective, they're seen as uninteresting. Then you've got the mass in the middle, where there is a lot of great things to be done, but are either slightly too risky, or there is not enough information about it, there's information asymmetry, or there actually needs to be a change in how it is presented. And I think this is really where the pooling comes in that working carefully in developing regions to be able to identify initiatives that have similar potential outcomes and impact, and scaling them up by bringing like-minded individuals together, even in terms of the potential investors, but also in terms of potential recipients. And then the other key issue is therefore how do you start that process? And I think that's where blended finance will come in particular, in terms of dealing with aggregating and pooling against this for this first loss.
Exactly, yeah. So for those of us who are maybe a little newer to finance, blended capital really talks about how we use grants and philanthropy and public capital to maybe leverage the private capital into these investments. So it's really going to become a key component to get us to be able to bring private sector into the market. Dauda, please tell us how is credit affecting investment in these markets?
Well, thank you very much, Jacinda. And before I respond to that, let me also tell you how it is important to deal with the issues about credit ratings. We are here in New York as part of the UN General Assembly's work to see how the international community can sort of mobilize the funding needed for developing countries to meet their development and climate needs. So credit rating agency plays a big role on that. Why? Because they are the one who are forging an opinion on the credibility, on the solvability and the credit worthiness of countries, whether they're able to pay on a timely basis or at full. And when they do so, that has actually direct implication on actually the decision by investors to come to those countries and invest. So I think it's extremely critical that this job is very much done in a very sort of professional and objective manner. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of talk about credit ratings, particularly where I'm from in Africa, where a lot of head of state have complained about actually the subjectivity in credit risk assessment. And why? Because I think there has been some work, including by our partner UNDP, that show that there is a misalignment between actually the actual credit rating assessment and the country's economic fundamentals. And that if we were to reduce that subjectivity in credit risk assessment, then we would be able to free more resources. Actually, those countries would be able to reduce their debt service payment so that they can use it for other purposes that can help them make progress toward the SDGs and climate action. I think this is so critical that we talked about it. Of course, there are actually responsibilities on both sides. It's not all about the issues and the fault of credit rating agencies. Borrowers and sovereigns also have their role to play to make sure that they also help improve their ratings, and we're happy to talk about this later.
Yes, so excited. And also, Dauda has some new and interesting credit rating things that are happening. And so we look forward to diving into that more in the conversation. And then John, not last but not least at all, but please can you fill us in on why capital adequacy and the prudential regulations are impacting this area?
Thank you. Well, it flows actually from what Jean-Paul and Daouda have been saying actually. So regulators in countries where banks are headquartered are seeking to preserve financial stability. And the latest current sort of set of rules relating to financial regulations stem from sort of developed in the aftermath of the financial crisis 2007, 2008, and are designed to ensure financial stability, which is a good thing. And what that means is banks need to hold essentially capital against a proportion of the loans that they issue. And that's one of the principles of fractional reserve banking. But those rules are geared, the capital that we must hold against the loans that we make are designed around preserving financial stability rather than delivering any environmental or social goals. And there's some tension that needs to be explored because when you're working inside a bank, you've got a certain amount of capital that you can lend against. The cost of that capital has a cost. And essentially what it means is if your returns are higher on lending to oil and gas than lending, say, to renewables or to other work that helps deliver on the SDGs, a bank will naturally, if it's meeting its fiduciary duty to its shareholders, will lend against the thing that is most profitable. So you can actually alter a bank's lending patterns by adjusting the amount of capital that needs to hold against lending to things that we want to deliver lending to, as opposed to things that we don't want to deliver lending to. And there's another argument to bring in, which is a lot of financial stability regulations are sort of built by looking in the rearview mirror. They're built by looking at historical patterns of default, which means that default is higher in African countries, default is higher in risky new technologies like renewables, and default is low in established technologies like hydrocarbons. Whereas we're actually living in a period of technological change, and we're seeing in places like Pakistan now, stranded assets in the hydrocarbon sector, the coal sector, really coming to crystallizing very quickly because consumers are installing photovoltaic panels generating their own power and essentially leaving a power company without anyone that wants to buy its power. So we need to look not in the rearview mirror but out of the windscreen and understand what the world is changing to and adjust the financial regulations so that we sort of essentially require banks to hold less capital against lending for things that will deliver on our low carbon objectives and hold more capital against those projects that risk becoming stranded assets in the future.
Thank you very much. And we've actually got Tom Taylor on the line, who is our partner from Aviva Insurance. And so maybe online they'll have a really good conversation about that. But let me just speak about that particular rule and why it's relevant. So as we look at how countries, cities, businesses, small, medium enterprises, local farmers, indigenous people, how they invest their resources, we look at how insurance funds and pension funds are able to invest their resources. And we realize that in most countries, in several countries in Africa, there are serious restrictions about how much they can invest in infrastructure, whether it be adaptation or resilience or mitigation. And that, in fact, they're investing in a lot of things like treasury bonds and other more stable economies. And so the idea is these are huge pools of capital that if even a percentage is redirected into the local domestic economy, that can help stimulate future and further investment. And so the idea is what do pension funds and insurance funds need in order to increase that percentage of allocation for local domestic infrastructure and sustainable and other things like that. Some of the things that we're looking at are like sustainability linked insurance policies. So like sustainability linked bonds, right? Like there are certain KPIs and metrics that if you meet those, you get certain different rates or different discounts. So I think the idea overall really today is to say 80 years after Bretton Woods, it was great. It started the World Bank. It started the IMF. We needed that at that time. But we today know what we need in order to have the future that we want. So if we had a blank canvas based on what we know today, based on the rules that we've outlined, based on the status quo, what would we change if we had the magic pen to allow that capital to flow to where we know that it needs to be in order to have the transition that we all are so passionately seeking. So with that said, we would like to divide into, let's start with the 4 groups, since we have 4 groups here, and then Yassine, maybe the group online does insurance and pension funds since Tom is there, and then that way he can strategically work with them. So 1 group in the front here, 1 group in the back there. Oh, we have a sitting outside? Well, if we need space, we can do, so we can divide up both sides into 2. Maybe I'll let you gentlemen kind of find your place, and then if you would like to talk about capital prudential regulations, you will join John and his team. If you would like to look at credit ratings, you have some ideas about how to hack the system, you can hang out with Dauda. JP will be happy to talk about how we can pool and aggregate. And then Peter will be talking about the system alignment and standardization. So gentlemen, please take your place wherever you'd like. 1 in each back corner, 1 in each front corner, and then we'll go from there.
Well, we had 1 interview which was more unpleasant than exciting. Once we got rid of that, we had a fairly concentrated discussion on the online seminar. We did talk about the role of pensions and insurance. I think there was some overlap in terms of the insurance and the prudential regulation insurance to John's introductory remarks. I think those elements are equally important. The way that insurers are regulated and have to set aside capital to make sure that they're going to be solvent is similarly important to that of banks. I think we talked a little bit about making sure that not only are we looking at regulating finance and financial institutions, but actually we need to change what's profitable and not profitable in the real economy, because that will move finance far faster than any regulation of institutions will, because ultimately they will always, as commercial institutions, follow the money. So that is a critical element that we, I think, need to include here. It's really important that in these increasing conversations about changing regulation, we don't let regulation be framed as an excuse for inaction, but nonetheless we do need a supportive regulatory environment so that it's not a barrier. But I think the far bigger barrier are misaligned incentives in the real economy. We talked about the role of pensions. We talked about the way that interpretation of the duties of pension providers and their fiduciary duties differs in different parts of the world. So, you're all in New York, where in the US there's a relatively restrictive interpretation of what duties require. I think probably in Europe and the UK there is a slightly broader interpretation, but nonetheless there's a nervousness amongst pension providers to allocate capital at scale to climate solutions and transition assets if there is a perception that they will deliver low returns in the short term, even if there's long-term benefit, and potentially doesn't need to frame the idea of acting in the best interests of beneficiaries. And ultimately, in the financial institutions, we're all dealing with someone else's money, whether it's their insurance premiums, whether it's their pensions, whether it's their savings, whether it's their investments. We're all dealing ultimately with citizens' money. And thinking about what actually the best interests of citizens requires. I drew the parallel between the evolution of the World Bank's mandate to eliminate poverty on a livable planet, and whether we need to evolve the way that we think about the duties of financial institutions. They do need to deliver returns to their clients, of course, and their shareholders, as John mentioned, but also that they need to do so that you can also have a livable planet to enjoy your pension, to enjoy the fruits of your investment, or to enjoy your dividends on it as well. So I think there are definitely too narrow and too short-term a view of some of those regulations and duties. And the last thing, just echoing what Nigel said in his intro, is we definitely need to get specific. I think in too many of these conversations, there's a throwaway line that regulation is a problem, or that the rules are a problem, or we need to say exactly what those rules are. And ultimately that means we need more lawyers and compliance people in the room. because they're the ones who understand those specific rules and those specific elements. And I hope that maybe some of those discussions in the room got into those sorts of details. I'll hand back to you. Thanks very much, and thanks to those on the online forum.
Okay, a lot to discuss. So we're going to summarize the sessions briefly. I just want to have two kind of key questions that I'll frame to the moderators. The first is like synthesize one or two of the common questions that came up, or let's say shared misunderstandings, right? The second piece I would ask you to comment on is what needs to be done by the end of the year, and how can we make it happen, or start making it happen this week while we're all together. So maybe Peter, would you like to get started on adaptation?
Yeah, so had a really good group, and it was great to get specific questions. So maybe to your first question, a couple things that came up, at least with adaptation and resilience. There's still a real need to define clearly what it is, which is an important part of building standards. Another one was how do we measure adaptation and resilience? It's a key part of, I think, elevating capital flow. Is how do we measure it? It needs to be local up. It's very locally based solution. So a lot of questions around how do we involve more SMEs and do it consistently. The other one was an interesting comment around getting clear on like what are the actual losses, especially from the insurance sector, that climate impacts have resulted in, and use that as a way to pull in financing, and then really highlighting and showcasing some of the best practices out there. There are some taxonomies out there, there are some frameworks, there are some funds. Finding a way to elevate those, to your second question, how can we elevate those to pull more into sort of the community by showing that it is a good return. You can live with longer time horizons for returns. And then also leveraging this idea that we can use philanthropy, insurance, and other things to de-risk projects, to pull in more from the banking sector. And yeah, I think finally coming around, some great questions around how we, how can we work better with investors? How can we leverage things out there like by Standard Charter and other organizations, but amplify that, to your second point. How can we get those out in these forums so we can amplify what they're doing and then pull in more stakeholders into this work to really elevate it? And systems, of course, it's a gap that needs to be advanced quickly.
Great. And just as one follow-up, I mean, you mentioned there's a variety of frameworks and standards. I know ISSB and ICMA are moving. Are these the types of frameworks we have to align to, or can you point out any more specific ones for the audience?
Yeah, there's, check out, like WBCSD has done a really good framework on how we talk to the private sector around adaptation. Another good one is Tailwind Climate. They're small, but they've come out with a really good taxonomy and adaptation. They're about to come out with a roadmap. And then there's some good ones out there just on funds. Page is a good one to look at, Meridium, the Turf Fund with Rockefeller. I mean, those are some frameworks and then taken into a fund. And so those are just the good ones to look at.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter, and participants in that discussion group as well. Maybe I'll move to John Paul Adam talking about aggregating first loss.
No, thank you. So in terms of the aggregation, we emphasize that we need to address it both at national levels, because there are countries that are facing those challenges and putting together bankable projects, as well as aggregating on a broader level, which is attractive for the level of foreign direct investment. And the need for actions that are happening precisely at that country level through banks, for example, around and with the support of governments for unifying taxonomies, and linking this as well to the development of pipelines. And working on pipelines, we recognize that the projects are usually there, but it's about addressing some of the needs from an investor framework as well as the needs from the community framework. We did recognize that generally there is a risk of not dealing with the real needs of communities and populations, and we have to find ways to really emphasize those at the outset and ensure that the role in particular of multilateral development banks and of government-driven banks can help address that. In the current context where there's a flight of capital away from emerging markets, and because I was moderating, we tend to focus a lot on Africa, but with higher interest rates in the global north, a tendency to see capital moving away, and we said that in this current environment, the use of blended financing, in particular credit enhancements, is very necessary to allow that flow of capital to happen. and recognizing that Africa currently only has 14% of its climate finance from the private sector. And unless the private sector is a mix of pushed but also incentivized to come and invest in Africa, that discrepancy and that discrepancy will continue to be in place. We also emphasize the currency risk issue, which has caused a lot of problems, both from an investor perspective, but also from the perspective of countries and debtors. Interestingly, in 2023, 70% of the additional cost of debt servicing in African countries was actually driven by negative currency risk. So using hedging and getting multilateral development banks in particular to support the most vulnerable countries to be able to hedge their currency risk. And we also talked about the importance of developing local currency capital markets, deepening those so that the private sector domestically can get more, can be more involved in investing in those aspects. We touched on the role of philanthropy, where they can support potentially in some of the de-risking, but also in addressing some of these development of projects and pipeline issues. But overall, we did emphasize that in the current environment, the multilateral development banks need to upscale the amount of credit enhancement and the vehicles by which this is done. And we recognize in Africa in particular, the African Development Bank can do it, but needs more support, and there are not enough institutions providing those de-risking mechanisms, and hence the need to move in that direction. Although we did recognize the establishment of the task force after COP28 on credit enhancement, which hopefully will help deliver some of these issues.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for the comments. I want to maybe point out two things. Is that first loss as an instrument is not readily available in public markets. So I can buy an insurance product right now if I'm doing project finance, but I can't buy a first loss guarantee, and there's no liquidity, there's no standardization that's actually accessible. So I think maybe that's something that can be pushed forward on some of these task force. And since this is beyond Bretton Woods, one of the key aspects that has helped make the IMF so stable is the development of what's called special drawing rights, or SDRs, which is a basket of internal currency that is used to hedge currency risk between 5 of the major nations. I think there's a real opportunity to develop a very similar currency that could be used at the IMF. That would be a basket of either African or South American countries' currencies to help hedge some of these liquidity risks and negative currency impacts that you're seeing from the debt service. So hopefully this is something that we can continue to drive forward in 2024 and beyond. Please, go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Allow me to thank, first of all, the members of our group. I think it was very lively, and the people were actually were making a lot of insightful remarks. I'm talking about the group on credit ratings, of course. I think essentially what we discussed were what was working and what wasn't working. I think mainly a lot of us actually felt like, yes, there was things that were working, but I think if you look at also the controversy and all of the discussion that you hear, there is maybe room for improving how credit ratings are done, particularly in some regions around the world. But I think the first thing that we recognize, and I think we were also happy to have some senior executives from credit ratings among us, is that it's not the mandate of credit rating agencies to drive capital to some specific sector, whether it is climate, whether it is, I guess, development or those. That's not their role. Their role is just to help the market form an opinion about the credit worthiness of a corporate or a sovereign. And I think that has to be clear. Now, of course, they have a responsibility in doing their sort of work, to do it in a way that very much help market participants to do their decision. And I think that's where we certainly felt like there was a need to focus on. So, yeah, what is not working? Of course, I think there was some recognition that maybe there is some scope for improving methodologies. There is some scope for also improving data, and when we talk about data, it's not only about credit ratings, it's also about governments and also sovereigns who are responsible for compiling them. So there is also actually scope for learning more about the practicality of ratings. I think this is something that also we discussed about. I think that's important. But also we need to admit and recognize that credit ratings are just one way to measure credit risk. and that the market participants should be also encouraged to use alternative sort of tools and methods. And I think that would be very much helpful if that was to be done. And that's something that certainly we discussed about. And I think the idea that Jean-Paul was talking about of maybe also promoting the use of credit enhancement tool can also actually help, because there was some examples that were given of some countries where some corporations were able to maintain rating that was much better than actually the sovereign, simply because they were benefiting from this type of tool. So this is something that we certainly need to keep in mind. But I think at the end of the day, what we felt as would be very much helpful as a step forward is to find a way to encourage a sort of stakeholders engagement. We're talking about here actually ways to bring together all of the actors that are involved, whether we're talking about governments, whether of course we're talking about credit rating agencies, whether we're talking about the private sectors, whether we're talking about, of course, domestic stakeholders, be it some of the non-governmental actors, but also most importantly also whether we're talking about multilateral institutions. Some talked about the IMF, MDBs, the World Bank and others. They all need to be convened and discuss about how best, not to talk about credit rating methodologies and stuff like that. That would not be the sort of idea, but to have something much more comprehensive. Recognizing that actually many countries are facing some issues like about how to sort of mobilize funding at, under better terms, and so that they can pay back their loans and be able to mobilize enough funding for climate and actions, how to really make sure that that type of engagement and convening would be focused on sort of reducing the cost of borrowing for those countries. Of course, and when you talk about reducing the cost of finance, you're talking about each of those stakeholders having a role to play, whether we're talking about the multilateral institution, whether we're talking about the credit ratings, whether also we're talking about the government themselves, because at the end of the day, government are also responsible for making sure that they have sound and strong policy and regulatory framework. They also have a big role to play. So if we convene, if we are able to really put that together, maybe we would be able to really, of course, at the same time, hopefully give some insight for credit rating agencies to do better their job, but at the same time also making sure that all the stakeholders are doing what they need to do to reduce the cost of borrowing for developing countries to be able to contribute adequately and effectively to the global effort for mobilizing more funding for climate action.
Very salient points, and I think refinancing debt is something that's becoming exceptionally popular for green bonds for corporates. I've seen very large corporations issue $500 million, $1 billion refinance debt, so I think you'll see a very big trend, especially now that the Fed has cut interest rates by 50 basis points. A lot of things now are refinancing, again, is becoming more attractive. Could you maybe, I know you're working on a project for credit ratings in Africa, new type. What can we do this week to help drive your initiative forward?
Well, where I'm from, South Africa, you're talking about more than 20 countries either being at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress. So basically, when you're talking about finding effective and timely way of restructuring debt, of course, there is a lot of countries there that would benefit from it. So I think if you tie it to the issue that we're talking about, the question is how you can really put in place some innovative financing instrument that can, first of all, allow those countries already to be able to restore their debt sustainability and be able also to raise enough funding for the purpose that we're talking about, most importantly, nature and sort of climate-based solution. But also how you can make sure that for those countries, because at the end of the day, even when you're talking about 20, you're talking about 54 African countries, so you're talking about the minority. How you can make sure that those countries that run the risk of finding or sort of joining those countries that are already in debt distress, they don't get into that. I think it means that you need to find sort of good ways to meet their liquidity needs. It means also you need to find good ways to allow them to have access to concessional funding for climate, because at the end of the day, when we are talking about adaptation, it's very much unfair that countries have to go and borrow to invest in adaptation when this is a global public good that can actually benefit all countries and the world in general. So you talked about what we are doing. We are hoping with some some of our partners, we are trying to push for better engagement between stakeholders, whether it is on credit rating issues, whether it is also on finding ways to also promote debt for climate and nature swaps, all of those innovative financing instruments that can very much support those African countries, but at the same time also act as a way to improve the delivery of global public goods.
Excellent, excellent. I'm looking forward to learning more about that this week. And John, maybe I know you had a discussion about how environmental and social risk is totally separate from financial stability. So did you find that to be the case in your conversations? If not, what can we do this week to help start changing the conversation around that?
Thanks. So we had a rich discussion, which I will only inadequately represent. The first thing which I think came out of the discussion is, where does the solution lie? It does not lie with the commercial banks. Like, you can't change the rules of football by asking the players to change the rules. It has to be the referee that changes the rules. The players play by the rules that the referees set. So there needs to be kind of a focus on the people that set the rules, and banks like Citi and Standard can make a lot of noise, but ultimately you need to bring the regulators and the policymakers together. When you bring those policymakers together, you need to have finance ministries, regulators, and climate ministries all in the same room in order to get to the solutions that we want. But in doing that, the discussion has to be around risk. One of the things we discussed was, you can't. A lot of the sort of regulators have sort of charter enshrinements that basically say, they are charged with looking after financial stability. They're not charged with delivering climate policy. So we can't just try and persuade them to be a vehicle of climate policy. What we need to do is speak the language that they will understand and can integrate into their own regulatory mechanism. So we need to speak the language of the physical risk of climate change upon assets. We need to speak about the risk of the transition to the low carbon economy and the risks of stranded assets and the risks on lending and so on. We need to talk about the risks that flow from nature and so on, so that they can integrate into that risk modelling, and you're speaking through that prism rather than trying to just enforce a policy lens upon regulators who are not essentially tooled up to receive that message. And then what does the solution look like? One of the things we discussed was it needs to not just involve the regulators, but also the MDBs and the credit rating agencies, for some reasons that kind of we went into. There's no point a commercial bank buying a guarantee off an MDB if the credit rating agencies don't recognise that guarantee, or the regulators don't recognise that guarantee in the amount of capital we need to hold. So all those rules need to be aligned so that there's a sort of sensible and coherent model. Ultimately, long-term resolutions, I think, my take, in an ideal world, you have a different, essentially, set of regulations in respect of green capital rather than brown capital, and that's the kind of thinking that is out there in China. That requires strong alignment around taxonomies and so on. That gets quite difficult if you to avoid the risk of greenwashing. But even if that's a long-term goal, a shorter-term goal might be to have this thing that has been proposed, that essentially you exempt a portion of a bank's capital from those criteria, and essentially you have a portion of a bank's capital that it can lend without regard to stability. 3-5% of the bank's capital is not going to undermine the capital adequacy of the bank, but it can use that essentially to sort of subsidise internally the cost of lending to green versus the cost of lending to brown. And the thing that gives me a little bit of hope is you don't necessarily need a huge change, because we're already lending to sustainable energy projects and zero emission vehicle manufacturers and so on around the world. You just need to tilt the scales so that internally the returns from lending to green exceed those from lending to brown. We already lend to green, we just need to accelerate the flows.
Wonderful, and I appreciate you ending on an optimistic note. I would encourage all the panelists and the people inspired in the audience to think about how can we actually start to implement and make progress on these ideas in 2024. I feel like we're on the cusp of something big, and I think everyone's schedules this week in Climate Week reflect that increasing clarity and closeness to implementing some of these solutions. So with that, I'll hand over to Sarah, the CEO of SLK Capital, to close out the session today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very insightful discussions. So as Jacinda explained, so they're officially put together these 45 commissioners. It started with the collaboration to identify the 5 rules, and going forward, all the discussions would be to further explore and refine them, so that a summary would be presented at some events at COP with all the outcome of all these discussions that took place today and over the past few months. So the rules that we've discussed, there is the capital adequacy requirements that are biased against novel technologies and geographies, and John's and the team insights have been very valuable to see how we can, with few changes, mobilize more capital through this capital adequacy. The credit rating methodologies and their influence on the attracting capital to sovereigns, decreasing their cost of capital. That saving could be used and channeled towards projects supported to climate projects. The aggregation and pooling of first tranche losses, what I would add to that, it's easier to do this pooling at the fund private capital level, in addition to being at the country and regional level, and not just at the project by project basis, because it's very time consuming, and even if we get to the same results, it's important, if we want to accelerate the flow of funds, to do it at bank or private capital providers level. Very insightful discussions from Peter and the group on the system alignment and standardizations, just so that we can speak the same language, and it starts with the definitions, and that's key to accelerate capital flows through adaptations in addition to mitigations project. And then the regulatory limitation on domestic insurance and pension fund, and we've seen that happening a lot, especially in Africa and other markets, where just a small shift, like just a percentage, it could be 5% or 10%, if they get unlocked, how they can accelerate and change. And a lot of also international investors are looking to see that local pension funds and insurance companies are investing in their own countries, and that would also send a very good signal so that we can attract capital. So all of that will be refined. The outcome of this discussion will be presented at COP. COP is just the beginning of this long journey together. The ultimate goal will be to present final reports that cover 3 key aspects. One are all these areas that have been previously overlooked but need to be addressed. The second one is to put together all these initiatives that are underway that need to be accelerated. And thirdly, some changes that have already been implemented but require re-evaluation and improvements. You will hear from Ambition Group, Jacinda and Nigel and the team, regular updates, newsletters, and on the progress of all these initiatives that offer a roadmap for aligning the regulatory changes with the global sustainability goals. Thank you very much.